Now, there's a card called Destiny Hero Diamond Dude, who has an effect where basically he can use the effects of spell cards without having to pay their cost. So in this video, we'll go over 10 of the best normal spell card effects as long as you ignore their costs. And at number 10, we have Phantasmal MARTYRS. This card has the effect to special summon 3 tokens with no other restrictions on those tokens for the rest of the turn. Now, there's a really good card called Scapegoat, which allows you to special summon 4 tokens, except these tokens cannot be tributed for a tribute summon, and the card itself locks you out of summoning other monsters for the rest of the turn. So it's only ever really used at the end of your opponent's turn, and is never really a first turn viable card option to play. And even then, the card was used so much it got limited as soon as the Link era started, because of how useful having 4 tokens on the field is. So being able to get out 3 tokens without restrictions for your special summons for the rest of the turn would be pretty decent, as long as you ignore its costs, which are so bad, I put this card as number 1 spot on my top 10 worst token generators in the game list. The effect itself is good. It's the cost that completely makes this card terrible, as you have to discard your entire hand and control a hard to bring out monster in order to even activate it. And that's going to be kind of a theme with all of the cards on this list. They will have pretty good effects, but really bad activation requirements, which Diamond Dude allows you to ignore. And at number 9, we have Bonding D20. This card has the effect that allows you to special summon either Water Dragon or Water Dragon Cluster from your hand, deck, or graveyard. And Water Dragon Cluster has the effect that when it's special summoned, your opponent's effect monsters cannot activate their effects for the rest of the turn, and also all of their attacks are changed to 0. Which is pretty good. If you're able to resolve Bonding D20, you don't really have to worry about your opponent's negates for the rest of the turn. At least not the ones from on board anyway. And it also has another effect where, on a spell speed 2, this card can tribute itself to special summon 2 water dragons from your hand or deck in defense position, ignoring their summoning conditions. So this card can tag out into 2 other level 8 monsters with decent stats, that themselves can float into 3 monsters each, assuming you have 3 very specific monsters in your graveyard anyway, and that their effects don't miss their timing. So for 1 card, you can potentially get 6 monsters on the field. But more realistically, you'll be getting 1 decent monster that can tag out into 2 other decent beatsticks if it's ever in danger of getting destroyed or removed from the field, which is pretty good. The only problem with playing Water Dragon Cluster normally is that Bonding D20 requires you to tribute 3 specific monsters from your hand or field in order to activate normally. So basically, you had to go -3 in order to bring out Water Dragon Cluster. And that's why it has pretty good effects. But if you get to ignore the -3 component of the card, then you get all of the benefits of Water Dragon Cluster without the pretty big downsides of its summoning requirement. And at number 8, we have Pot of Desires. This card has the effect to draw 2 cards, basically the same as Pot of Greed. And even with this card's pretty harsh activation requirement, where you have to banish about 1/4 of your deck face down in order to use it, this card sees tons of play in all kinds of meta decks. Because the effect of drawing 2 cards is kind of worth getting rid of 1/4 of your deck. And since this card is played anyway, it's kind of a no-brainer of one you'd want to use without having to pay its costs. Kind of in the same way Destiny Draw was used with Diamond Dude, even though its cost isn't really that hard to pull off in a Diamond Dude deck anyway. Drawing 2 cards is just really good. Being able to do it without having to pay the cost is even better. And at number 7, we have Magical Stone Excavation. This card simply has the effect of allowing you to add 1 spell card from your graveyard to your hand. And the effect of this one being good is entirely dependent on how valuable the spell card you add back to your hand is. If you use this effect to recycle a Monster Reborn, for example, a card with a really good effect that's not once per turn, that's essentially like having a second Monster Reborn, which is very good in a lot of different kinds of combo decks. Although if you're playing a deck that only has hard once per turn effects on their spell cards, or your spell cards is just not that super valuable where you'd want to recover them, then it's probably not that useful. This card kind of has a heavy restriction of discarding 2 cards in order to use it, because it's very easy to accidentally create some kind of infinite loop or combo with allowing you to easily recycle spell cards from the graveyard. And this card was a cornerstone in the Empty Jar deck, as it allowed you to recover whichever specific spell you needed in order to keep flipping down Morphing Jar over and over. And this card was even good enough to be limited for years. So being able to bypass its cost of discarding 2 cards in order to use its effect is pretty good, but only in very specific kinds of combo decks, or just generally very powerful cards that you'd like to be able to use more than once per duel, like Monster Reborn or Scapegoat. And at number 6, we have Primal Seed, a card that allows you to recycle any 2 cards that are banished. Considering how easy it is to banish cards nowadays, and how a lot of decks do it as kind of their engines, being able to recycle any 2 banished cards, as this works on monsters, spells, or traps, is really good. And the cost for this card is to normally control one of 2 specific named monsters that honestly aren't very hard to bring out. It's just this card is rarely played in decks that actually use those 2 monsters, and it's much more useful in a deck that might be able to ignore its cost and just use the effect as is. And at number 5, we have Rank Up Magic, the 7th one. Now this card has an effect where you can cheat out an Exceeds monster from your extra deck as long as it's numbers 101 through 107, and then immediately after you bring that card out, you can rank it up with one of its C101 through C107 versions. So for example, you could bring out number 101 Silent Honor Arc, and then immediately rank it up with number C101 Silent Honor Dark, who has an effect that allows it to absorb special summon monsters and attach them as Exceeds materials to itself. And also, if the card is destroyed and you have a number 101 Silent Honor Arc in your graveyard, this card can basically just revive itself and then absorb another monster into it. You can also use it on number 107 in order to rank it up into number C107, who will immediately have an effect to tribute 2 other monsters, so you can make 3 attacks, and it can also detach its Exceeds material to lock your opponent out of card effects for a turn. So the effect is really good. The cost of this card though is that you can only activate it if you drew it during your normal draw phase, and then you must activate the card immediately during your main phase 1, and you can only use its effect once per duel anyway. So normally this card is a little bit too cumbersome to use, but it has a great effect with a lot of different cards it can bring out. And at number 4, we have Final Inzektion. This card can destroy all cards on your opponent's side of the field, and then during the battle phase of this turn, your opponent won't be able to activate monster effects in the hand or graveyard. So basically, you can use this card to wipe out your opponent's board, and then prevent them from trying to stop the battle phase with battle phase monster effects, with cards like Bacon Saver, Gore's the Emissary of Darkness, or Battle Fader. And since most cards that can stop attacks during the battle phase happen to be monsters that activate in the hand or graveyard, this effect actually does a pretty good job of making sure all of your direct attacks will go through, unless your opponent has a Spiritual Swords of Revealing Light in their graveyard. I think that's like one of the few graveyard effects that can stop attacks, which is tied to a non-monster card. Of course, being able to destroy all of your opponent's cards and getting all of your attacks to go through during your battle phase is honestly not super important. The average meta deck doesn't really have a problem with getting rid of your opponent's monsters and then attacking directly anyway. But if you could do all of this from one card, that's pretty great. And its usual activation cost is to send 5 face-up Inzektor cards you control to the graveyard. So normally you'd need to go -6 in order to even use this effect. And at number 3, we have Crystal Abundance. This card's effect is to send all cards in the field to the graveyard, and then you can special summon as many Crystal Beast monsters from your graveyard equal to the amount of your opponent's cards sent to the graveyard. And here's the thing about this card. It sends the cards to the graveyard and doesn't destroy them. That's actually a pretty big distinction, because destroying the card would mean cards that can prevent themselves from being destroyed by card effects, like Dingirsu or Thunder Dragon Colossus, will get sent to the graveyard with Crystal Abundance's effect without ever getting a chance to prevent the destruction, since it technically doesn't destroy. And anything which can get rid of your opponent's monsters in a way that doesn't destroy or target them is super valuable and works against a whole bunch of normally really hard to take out monsters. And then also, if you happen to be playing Crystal Beasts in your deck, you also get a whole bunch of monsters on the field, especially since this card's normal activation requirement is to send 4 Crystal Beast monsters from your spell trap card zones to the graveyard. So, another card that requires you to go for a huge minus in order to activate its effect. Although Crystal Beast decks aren't very good, so it's basically on here for the board wipe effect and not the special summon from the graveyard thing. And since this card has better removal than Final Inzektion, I do have to give it a slightly higher spot on this list, even if Final Inzektion only destroys your opponent's cards and not your own. And at number 2, we have the Beginning of the End. This card has the effect to draw 3 cards, which is 1 more card than the number 8 spot on this list. Now, the normal cost of this card is to have 7 or more dark monsters in your graveyard, and then you must banish 5 of them in order to draw those 3 cards. And drawing 3 cards is really good, and that's why this card was played in danger decks that were trying to draw through their entire deck in one turn. Because being able to turn all of those dangers in the graveyard into a resource to activate this 1 card gave them so much advantage that it was real easy to draw through your entire deck in that 1 turn, and allowed the slash draw FTK to even work. And it's really hard to find a better card that has a great effect like just drawing 3 cards. But I think the number 1 spot has a really good effect if you're able to ignore its activation requirements. And at number 1, we have the Law of the Normal. This card's effect allows you to destroy all cards in the field and forces both players to discard their entire hands. So it's almost like a Crystal Abundance if it also got rid of both players' hands. And it's this destroying your opponent's hand part of the effect that makes it really good, because there's few cards in the game that actually allow you to discard all of the cards from your opponent's hand. And they're generally tied to really powerful or hard to pull off effects, and Law of the Normal kind of fits into that category, as its normal activation requirement is to control exactly 5 face-up level 2 or lower normal monsters. Tokens do count as normal monsters though, so it's not that difficult to pull off. It's just kind of gimmicky, because it also gets rid of your hand as well. But if we're going for the most powerful normal spell card effect in the game, regardless of its activation requirement, then that kind of has to go to Law of the Normal, because it's a full board and hand wipe, and it's rare for 1 card to be able to do either of those things, let alone both. Alright, and that's it for the video. Are there any other really strong effects with normal spell cards that I may have missed? Or do you have an idea for a future video that's really gimmicky, just like this one? Because I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And also, don't forget to subscribe for weekly videos just like this one.